Today we're going to continue with section 1.5, and our objectives today are we're going to identify midpoints of segments and identify bisectors and trisectors of both segments and angles. So we're going to look at some more vocabulary words. And our first vocab word is segment bisector. It's a point, segment, ray, or line that divides a segment into two congruent segments. All right, so to identify this or show what it means with a picture, I've got a segment. So remember, a segment starts at a point, ends at a point. So I'm going to call that segment AC. And then it can be anything, like it says. It can be a point, a segment, a ray, or a line that divides this segment. So I'll demonstrate it with a point. So a point, I'm going to call it B. Obviously, if it is dividing it into two, it's got to be in the middle. And remember, to indicate then that B is truly in the middle, we have to indicate with tick marks that we've got two congruent segments. So based off of this picture, I would say that the point B bisects the segment AC. Okay, I'm going to give you another picture. So say we have our segment, let's call it DF. And this time I'll show you that, once again, it doesn't just have to be a point, but it could be another segment, array, or a line. So here's a point. Let me say that we do a line this time. I'm going to call it line M. All right, and it's intersecting that segment at point E. And then once again, if it's the segment DF that's being bisected, I'm going to indicate it this time with two tick marks on either side. And this time, this indicates that it's line M that bisects the segment, and this segment would be segment DF. But I could have taken that line and I could have just made it an array, or I could have just made it a segment. So here are just two pictures out of the four potential types of things that could bisect a segment. A midpoint is the bisection point of the segment. Okay, so if I have a segment, I'm going to call that segment GI. A midpoint, notice how it has the word point in it, so it has to be a point. I'm going to call that point H. And because it's the bisection point, well, we just talked about what it meant to bisect a segment. It has to divide that segment into two. So like here is a different type of tick mark indicating that those two smaller segments, GH and HI, are congruent. So this time I would say that H is the midpoint, and I'm going to abbreviate midpoint like this. So there's my little abbreviation for the word midpoint. H is the midpoint of the segment GI. All right, notice that my note down here, super important. Angles will not have midpoints, only segments do. To trisect, we'll think of the word tri, like tricycle has three wheels, or triangle has three sides. So to trisect means that we're either dividing a segment or an angle into three congruent pieces. Okay, so let's take a segment. Let's call that segment AD. To trisect it means that I'm going to have two additional points. Let's call those points B and C. And notice now AB is a segment, BC is a segment, CD is a segment. Notice how I indicated with one tick mark on each of those smaller segments. This tells us that the points B and C trisect the segment AD. Okay, so we took one big segment and we cut it into three equal or congruent pieces. It can be the same thing with an angle. So let me indicate with a picture here. So here we have an angle. I'm going to call this angle EFG. Okay, and so then I'm going to have a couple of more rays shooting out of the vertex of that angle. I'm going to call this ray FH and ray FI. But notice that now that one big angle of EFG is broken into 3 smaller angles, and to indicate that those smaller angles are congruent, well, they have to all be marked the same. So notice that in this case, it's the ray FH and it's the ray FI that trisect the angle of EFG. Okay, so when it's a segment, it's points that trisect. Technically, I could have had segments that help trisect or anything along those lines. Here, when I'm talking angle, it's rays that trisect. An angle bisector. So a ray that divides an angle into 2 congruent angles. We've already talked about what it meant to bisect a segment. Well, now it's the same idea for talking about an angle. So let me sketch a picture. Here is an angle. I'm going to call this angle QST. All right, so I have to have another ray at that vertex of S. I'm going to call that the ray SR, and then here's my markings. They're the same markings, which indicates I have 2 smaller congruent angles. So in this, it's the ray SR that bisects the angle of QST. All right, so now let's take all of those